I'm 64 years old. That's not something I used to say out loud. I preferred to let people guess, to hide behind good lighting and polite smiles. But age has a way of announcing itself, through silence, through routines, through the way no one really looks at you anymore. By the time this story began, I had already accepted that my life had settled into its final shape. Or so I thought. My marriage had lasted decades. Long enough to outlive passion, arguments, even disappointment. What remained was something quieter. Predictable. We shared meals, bills, and the same bed, but not our thoughts. Conversations were practical, necessary, safe. We had learned how not to hurt each other, which also meant we had learned how not to reach each other. I don't say that to make my spouse the villain. They weren't cruel. They were simply absent. Or maybe I was. It's hard to tell who leaves first when no one says goodbye. Most days followed the same rhythm. Wake up, coffee growing cold on the counter. The house filled with familiar noises that meant nothing anymore. I moved through rooms like a guest in my own life, careful not to disturb what little balance remained. I told myself this was maturity. Stability. The reward for surviving younger mistakes. But loneliness doesn't disappear just because you name it something nicer. What frightened me most wasn't growing older, it was becoming invisible. Being touched only by accident. Spoken to only when necessary. I missed being seen as more than a role I had already played too well. Spouse, partner, background presence. That was when he entered my life. There was nothing dramatic about our first meeting. No spark, no music swelling in the background. Just a brief interaction in an ordinary place. He was 27. I noticed that fact immediately, not with desire, but with distance. An age so far from mine it felt almost inappropriate to acknowledge. He spoke casually, kindly. He looked at me when I spoke, not past me, not through me. It startled me more than it should have. People don't realize how rare that becomes with time, being fully acknowledged without expectation. I remember thinking how young he sounded, how unburdened. There was a lightness in the way he moved, the way he laughed without apology. I told myself I enjoyed the contrast the way one enjoys a warm day in late autumn, pleasant, but temporary. When the moment ended, I didn't think about him again. Or at least, that's what I told myself. But later that night, lying beside my spouse, staring into the dark, I realized something unsettling. For the first time in a long while, my thoughts weren't empty. They weren't heavy either. They were awake, and somewhere deep inside me, a quiet voice whispered a dangerous truth. I wasn't done feeling yet. I didn't notice the change all at once. It crept in slowly, disguising itself as coincidence. Another brief conversation, another shared moment that felt harmless enough to ignore. I told myself it was normal to enjoy company, that at my age, attention meant nothing more than politeness. Still, I began to look forward to seeing him. Our conversations grew longer without either of us acknowledging it. What started as small talk drifted into something softer, more personal. He asked questions, real ones. Not out of obligation, but curiosity. When I answered, he listened. Not with impatience or distraction, but with interest that made me feel as though my words mattered again. I found myself laughing more easily. Catching myself mid-sentence, surprised by how much I was sharing. Things I hadn't said out loud in years slipped through without effort. I noticed how relaxed I felt around him, how the constant carefulness I carried everywhere else seemed to fade. And then there was the age difference. I was painfully aware of it. 64 and 27, numbers that should have stood between us like a wall. I reminded myself of it often, as if repetition could turn it into protection. I told myself he was just being kind. That anything else would be ridiculous. Embarrassing. Yet there were moments, small, almost invisible ones, that unsettled me. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me. The way he remembered details I'd mentioned in passing. The way his attention didn't feel rushed, as if he wasn't trying to escape the conversation the moment it slowed. At home, nothing had changed. Or maybe everything had. My spouse still spoke in the same measured tones, still asked the same practical questions. But I was different. I was distracted. I found myself comparing without meaning to, how it felt to be heard versus how it felt to be tolerated. The first message came unexpectedly. A simple note. Casual. Friendly. There was nothing inappropriate about it, and yet my heart reacted as though it was something more. I reread it longer than necessary. I smiled without realizing I was doing it. Soon, messages became a quiet part of my day. Not constant, not obvious, just enough to matter. I started checking my phone more often, then hiding the habit from myself by calling it curiosity. I didn't mention him to my spouse. There was no reason to, I told myself. It wasn't a lie, just an omission. But omission is where secrets begin. I started choosing words more carefully, deleting messages that felt too personal, even though nothing explicit had been said. I told myself I was being responsible, that I was protecting everyone involved. After all, nothing had happened. Not really. Still, I could feel a shift inside me, an emotional leaning I pretended not to notice. I waited for his replies. I wondered what he would think of things I hadn't yet said. I felt lighter when I heard from him, heavier when I didn't. One evening, sitting alone with the television murmuring in the background, I realized something that made my chest tighten. I was no longer just enjoying the attention. I was depending on it. And that was the moment I should have stepped back. I had always believed there were certain lines I would never cross. Not because I was especially virtuous, but because the consequences were too heavy to carry. Infidelity was one of those lines. I had judged others quietly, confidently certain that I was different. That age, experience, and everything I had built would protect me from that kind of mistake. I was wrong. The moment didn't arrive dramatically. There was no plan, no declaration. Just an invitation that sounded harmless enough, wrapped in familiarity and trust. A private space. A conversation that lingered longer than it should have. I told myself I could handle it. That I was still in control. But control is fragile when you've been starving. The room felt quiet in a way that pressed against my thoughts. Words slowed. The air seemed heavier, as if it knew something was about to change. I became acutely aware of how close he was, not touching, not yet, but near enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence. My heart beat louder than it should have. There was a pause, the kind that asks a question without speaking it. I thought of my spouse, of the life I would be risking, of the version of myself I believed I was. And still, I didn't move away. Crossing the line didn't feel sudden. It felt like giving in to something that had already happened inside me. I won't describe details. They don't matter. What matters is the realization that followed, the instant understanding that I had stepped into a moment I could never fully undo. Afterward, the silence was different. Not charged, not expectant. Just real. I felt suspended between two versions of my life, unsure where I belonged. There was guilt, sharp and immediate, curling in my chest. But beneath it was something else I wasn't prepared for, relief. To feel desired, chosen, alive. That scared me more than the guilt. I went home as if nothing had happened. The drive felt longer than usual, every red light an opportunity to turn back time. When I walked through the door, the familiar sounds of my home greeted me like an accusation. My spouse asked a simple question. I answered calmly, too calmly, amazed at how easily the lie slipped into place. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, counting breaths that refused to slow. My body was there, but my mind was elsewhere, caught between memory and fear. I realized then that the act itself wasn't the true betrayal. The real betrayal was what followed. I had learned how to divide my life, how to carry two realities at once. One built on routine and shared history, the other on secrecy and stolen moments. I became careful, more attentive, not out of love, but out of fear of being discovered. I told myself it would end, that it had to, but deep down, I knew the truth. Once you cross a line you swore you never would, the world doesn't split in two. It tilts. Guilt doesn't arrive all at once. It settles in quietly, like dust, coating everything when you're not looking. I carried it with me through ordinary days, through shared meals, through familiar conversations, through nights spent lying beside someone who trusted me completely. The weight of it changed the way I moved through my own home. Sleep became shallow. I woke before dawn, staring into the dim light, replaying moments I couldn't take back. I avoided my spouse's eyes more than before, afraid they might see something I hadn't said. Every question felt loaded, every silence felt dangerous. The younger man changed too. Or maybe I was finally seeing him clearly. The ease between us fractured under the reality of what we had done. Sometimes he wanted more time, more honesty, more space in my life than I could give. Other times, he pulled away, reminded suddenly of the difference between us. Our ages stopped being abstract numbers and became obstacles neither of us knew how to move around. I began to understand something painful. What had awakened me was also unsustainable. He was still at the beginning of his life, looking forward. I was standing in the long shadow of everything I had already built. What felt intoxicating in secrecy felt fragile in daylight. At home, the risk of discovery grew heavier. Small things unsettled me, a misplaced phone, a question asked twice, a pause in conversation that lasted a second too long. I imagined scenarios constantly: confession, confrontation, collapse, each possibility worse than the last. And yet, I didn't confess. Not because I felt justified, but because I was afraid of what honesty would destroy. I told myself I was protecting my spouse from pain, even as I carried the knowledge alone. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had already broken what mattered. Silence was just another form of selfishness. There were moments when I thought about ending everything, cutting contact, returning fully to the life I had nearly abandoned. But endings are never clean when feelings are involved. The younger man had become more than a mistake. He was a reminder of who I had been, and who I still wanted to believe I could be. One evening, standing alone in the house, I noticed a packed bag resting near the door. Not mine, just something ordinary, waiting to be used. Still, it felt symbolic. Like a question I had been avoiding. Leave, confess, stay and pretend. I realized then that there would be no moment of clarity, no perfect choice. Only consequences I hadn't yet faced. The story didn't end with resolution or redemption. It ended with uncertainty. I'm 64 years old. He's 27. And I live every day with the knowledge that one decision tilted my life in a direction I can't fully control anymore. Nothing goes back to normal after that. Not really.